We're going to do verses 1 and 3. Come thou almighty King, help us thy name to sing, help us to praise, Father all glorious, for all victorious, come and reign over us, ancient of days. O Lord our God, to thee the highest praises be. It's evermore. Thy sovereign majesty, may we in glory see, and to eternity love and adore. Right, one more song, and Brother Elijah will lead us in our opening prayer, and then that'll be followed by Brother Dave's lesson for this evening. I kind of just volunteered myself to pick a couple songs, so I haven't got to say it. 749. 749. We'll sing the first and fourth verse of this song also. And if it's comfortable for you, stand and we will sing it. There is a habitation built by the living God for all of every nation to sing that grand of hope. O Zion, Zion, thy gates to see. O Zion, Zion, when shall I dwell in thee? Within its pearly portals, angelic armies sing, with glorified immortals, the praises of its King. O Zion, Zion,
Good evening. This feels kind of strange. And I think the battery's down. Let's see if we can work it this way. All right. The only reason I'm worried about that, I can talk loud enough where everybody can hear me, but they're also streaming, so I want to make sure everybody at home can hear as well. So this is our first Wednesday night to be coming back, and what we're planning to do throughout the summer is have different men get up. Joe was going to talk about this, but I guess I will since I'm starting this off tonight. We're going to have some different men that we're going to line up to do the Wednesday night lessons, and we'll just do like we did tonight, have a song or two and start in, and you can preach it or do it like Bible class, however you want to, and then go through the summer that way. And then when we get to the fall quarter, Joe will pick back up with the class he was doing before, and of course, as soon as we get everything rolling again, we'll pick back up with our Holy Spirit study in the Sunday morning class, and hopefully we're on our way back to getting everything rolling again. So tonight, we're going to talk about the idea of the confinement. You know, this is not the first time that people have been confined into their home or into a space where they couldn't be around other people. In fact, the first time in the Bible that we read about or hear about something like a confinement is going back to Noah. Noah, if you'll remember, by not a government order, but by God's order, Noah was confined, and his wife and his 3 sons and each of their respective wives, 8 people, were confined on the ark. Does anybody know how long? For just a little over a year. You can sit and add up all the different times it gives. If you go through chapter 7 and 8 of Genesis, you can read about how long it rained, and then how long the waters were still prevailing. And then when they finally started assuaging, started going away, and finally when it was dry. You can add all of that up and try to run all those figures, but you can also just read what the text says. It tells us that Noah went in the ark in the 600th year of his life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day. So the way we would have that on our calendar would be February 17th. I don't know what they called it back then. 2nd month, 17th day, in his 600th year. And it was in the 601st year, the 2nd month, the 27th day, when they were able to come out of the ark. So you've got a year and 10 days that Noah and his family were on the ark. That's a long time. That's a long time for 8 people to be closed up in a floating structure with a bunch of animals. How many animals were on the ark? I don't know either. A bunch. 2 of every kind of animal. 7 of the clean animals. What was the distinction back then in Noah's time for the clean and the unclean animals? What difference did it make whether it was clean or unclean? Sacrifice. Many times people say, well, they put 7 of each clean animal so they could eat them. Well, 7 animals of the clean ones probably wouldn't have lasted 8 people for a whole year on there. Plus, what else do we know about Noah and his family in the time on the ark? As far as eating animals. They weren't eating animals. Not only were they not eating them just because they were on the ark, before the flood, we don't read about mankind eating animals at all. When God told Noah what he was going to do, gave him all the instructions, do you remember what God told him to do about provisions for food? He told him put enough green food on the ark for all of the animals and for the people. It's not until they come off of the ark that God puts the fear of man into the animals, and he tells Noah and his family they can start eating the animals. So apparently, not only were Noah and his family not eating the animals on the ark, but the lions weren't eating the gazelles on the ark. So everything that went on the ark was put there for what purpose? Not just reproduction. Why were they put on the ark? For their safety, for their preservation. If they were going to die, God could have just left them off the ark. Everything, every animal, and all the people were put there for preservation, security, safety. So when you start looking at this situation, we look at this time that we've been separated in our homes. And of course, it wasn't a total shutdown and separation. There were many jobs still going on, things that they called essential jobs, where needs have to be met. And so people were working, people were going out and getting what they needed. How about this, where you're confined into one spot for a whole year? For a year, they were on that ark. Wonder what it smelled like. I wonder what their feelings were every day. Whenever they woke up, I guess they still went to bed when it got dark and got up when it was light outside and did around during the day. I wonder what jobs they had. You ever stop and think about that? I wonder who got the, as we called it when I was in high school, and they'd have a parade and have horses and stuff. Somebody was always the pooper scooper. I mean, think about it. You'd have some jobs to do on the ark, I'm sure, every day. Making sure everything was fed, everything was clean, everything was taken care of. But for a year, they were in this. Now, granted, it was a big structure. It wasn't like any of our houses. Anybody remember the dimensions of the ark? It was about the length of a football field. It was big. About the length of a football field. It was pretty wide, had 3 stories in it. Yeah, 75 feet wide. This was a big structure, much bigger than what any of us live in. But they lived in there with 2 of every kind of animal, 7 of each of the clean animals, and they were on there for a year period. They were quarantined. But this quarantine was not about whether or not you'd get sick or just for safety, just in case. This was either be in the ark or die. What was going on while Noah and his family were on the ark? Initially, what was going on was everything that lived on earth and breathed air was being killed. It was a worldwide massacre of every land animal and every human being, except the ones on the ark. A worldwide massacre. What does that say about God? Yes. You know, sometimes we hear people say when a catastrophe happens, and let's understand something right up front. I am not equating the flood to a tsunami or a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake or anything of any sort like that. The bubonic plague, the black plague. We're not talking about anything like that. Why are we not comparing the flood to any of those other things? Number one, they're not worldwide, so the scope of it's not the same. We don't know what causes these things. We know that nature is here, and that within the scope of nature, we have a lot of things that can happen and that we deal with. But there's not any one of us who can say that God caused a storm to happen, that God caused an earthquake to happen. Why can we not say that? Because God didn't tell us. How do we know God brought the flood? He said he was going to. He did it, and then said afterwards, I did it. Now, he tells us there's a reason for why he brought the flood. To destroy all of mankind. Because they had become so sinful, so wicked. It repented God that he made man. What does that mean? He was sorry that he created man. And so he said, I am going to kill all of them. You realize in Genesis 6, the beginning of the chapter, when this is being discussed, God says, it repented him that he made man, and so I'm going to wipe all of them out. Why is verse 8 so important to read in Genesis 6? What does verse 8 say? Why does it mention that Noah found grace? What's the point of that? Because God had already said, I'm going to kill Noah. No, he didn't say that specifically, did he? He said, I'm going to kill everybody. If he didn't say that, then verse 8 would have no meaning. If he said at the beginning, I'm going to kill everybody but Noah and his family, then that was his decision of judgment. There would not have been a need for statement of his grace being given, reaching out to Noah. The reason that it's mentioned is because God's statement of judgment included Noah, Mrs. Noah, the 3 sons, and their wives. So, when he stated, I'm going to kill everybody, they're included in that. But then we read the further statement, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So, a difference was made. First, he says, I'm going to wipe mankind out. Then he says, I'm going to wipe mankind out except for Noah and his family. And throughout Genesis 6, 7, and 8, you're going to read that God makes a covenant with Noah. He makes a covenant in the sense of, I'm going to spare you and your family, and you are going to do what I tell you to do. And what does Noah do? Everything that God told him to do, he did. That's Genesis 6:22. Everything that God said to Noah by way of instruction, by way of command, Noah did everything. So, God did what he said he would do. Noah held up his side of the covenant. And so what was the result of that? You got an ark with 8 people and a whole bunch of animals that were spared from the destruction that God said, I'm going to bring on everybody. No, certainly not. He chose a man who had good character. Now, was Noah flawless? No. It doesn't tell us that he had never sinned. So would God have been just if he had killed Noah in the flood as well? Do this. Yes. Once we have committed sin, then God would be just in doing whatever to any of us. Period. That's why any form of deliverance from God's judgment is out of grace. That's why it says it right there in verse 8. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So, God commanded Noah to build an ark. Noah works for quite some time, years, building this ark. I would assume that since Noah is 600 when the flood comes, and his sons are right at 100 years old when the flood comes, I would assume that his sons would have helped him build the ark. We just don't get much detail about that, do we? I've seen pictures drawn in Bible story books and different things of big crews out there working on the ark. I don't know that there were big crews. If there were big crews, it might not have taken so long to build. It might have just been that family. There might not have been anybody else helping them. Maybe if they had people that worked for them or something. I just don't know. We can speculate about that. We don't have any information about that. All we know is that Noah built the ark. He may have had the help of his family. They may have had some other workers that helped them, but they worked and they built this structure that was built out of one type of wood. Now, what does that tell you? Built out of gopher wood. You decide you're going to build a house, and you decide, I want to build this entire house out of one kind of wood. What do you have to do? You got to find the least expensive supplier, right? Where do they get the wood? Wherever it grows. Wherever that wood grows, They have somebody that cuts it, somebody that takes it to the sawmill and cuts it into actual lumber, and finally somebody who supplies it where you can buy it, and if they've got good enough supply, you can buy all cypress wood or all cedar wood or whatever you want and build a whole house out of it. But you think about the chain that makes that happen. Unless you build out of pine and you're sitting on a hill that's just filled with pines, which maybe that was it. Maybe there was a gopher wood forest right there around Noah, and so they could just start cutting trees and building. That would make it easier. But if there wasn't a gopher wood forest, then they would have had to go places and find the wood and then bring the wood back. And that they couldn't do it on a train or do it by trucks or something like that. It would have been a lot more time intensive. So you think about what they went through, the materials that they would have had to use, the tools they had to work with would have been extremely primitive compared to what we have now. So all the time, all the work, and all the while knowing that God said, judgment's coming. Do you know who first talked about the judgment of the flood? God, obviously, yes. But what human first talked about, that we read about in the Bible, first talked about the judgment that was coming, that would affect the whole world? No. It's about the flood. Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather. If you read in Jude, you're going to read that Enoch was given prophecy to speak to people about this coming judgment that was going to be for the whole world. So the first talking about it was 3 generations before Noah came along. When Noah came along, the talking about it shifted from this is going to happen one day to this is going to happen pretty soon. And so he started building the ark, started getting things ready. When the time came that the flood was very near, God started sending the animals to Noah. Noah and his family did not have to go out with lassos and catch all the animals and put them on the ark. God brought the animals to them so that they could simply go on the ark. And when the animals went on the ark, Noah had already been instructed to put green food on the ark so they'd have what they needed. And then Noah and his family were told to go into the ark. How long before the flood actually started did Noah and his family go into the ark? A week, 7 days. They went on there 7 days before the windows of the heavens were opened, the great fountains of the great deep were broken up, the windows of heaven were opened, and then, of course, the flood, the onslaught happens. Have you seen the pictures where Noah and his family are on the ark, maybe looking out the window, and there are people outside beating on the door, let us in, let us in. I don't think there was that opportunity. From what those are people's imaginations. I'm not saying that that's evil. I just don't think it's right. What happened when the flood took place? Fountains of the great deep are broken open. What does that sound like to you? Possibly earthquakes and things that would trigger letting the water come out. The only fountains that I know of that would let stuff come out really forcefully are volcanoes. But perhaps God broke open the earth and brought it out in other ways as well. But you're talking about something that's going to overwhelm the earth with water quickly.
You were talking about the animals coming to know. Even today, animals can alert to a disaster.
Yes, that's right. I don't know that they could alert to this one, because this was not going to be shifts in barometric pressure and humidity and things like this. God caused the fountains of the great deep to break open, the windows of heaven. By the way, what heaven is that talking about? This is not talking about where God resides. It's talking about the water in the skies. You read through the Bible, you see several different areas that are referred to as a heaven. The air that we breathe, the atmosphere, going up out into space, and then where God dwells. So several different areas that are called heaven, not always talking about the same thing. So obviously it's not that God was wading around in water and then that fell out. He's talking about the atmosphere where rain comes from. And so there's enough water out there to rain 40 days and 40 nights. With the fountains of the great deep pumping water, with the rain falling, the water levels on the earth rise to 15 cubits, somewhere around 45, 50 feet above the tallest mountains on earth. That's a lot of water. That's a lot of water. Meteorologists who study our atmosphere say that if all the water in our atmosphere rained down all at once on the earth, it would raise the level of the oceans maybe an inch or two, which would be drastic to this earth. But there's just not that much water out there anymore. So you're talking about some very big things happening that God prepared this earth to be able to cause that cannot happen again. You know, God told Noah after all of this, I'll never do that to earth again. Well, there's a very good reason why he'll never do that to earth again. He only set it up to happen once. You realize that? Once all that water came down and then finally went away, was dealt with, it's not there the same way anymore. It's not out there waiting and ready to come down like it was. The earth was reshaped in the flood. What does the Bible say about the reshaping of the earth? Valleys were turned into mountains, mountains into valleys. You know, we look at the continents. What's it? Pangea? You look at the continents, you take them and start moving them back closer together like puzzle pieces, and you know what you find? They fit. So maybe before the flood, it was one big landmass. And when the flood took place, it separated them. I don't know that for certain. I know from what we read in the Psalms that there was some reshaping to the earth in the flood. Not only did all the land animals die and all of mankind, except for the ones on the ark, but the earth itself was permanently changed. And so when we start reading and understanding what was going on, we understand the importance of the ark, of this place of safety, of this quarantine that Noah and his family went through. If you weren't on the ark, you were dead. That's all there was to it. You might be a good swimmer, but I don't know that you can swim in that kind of a catastrophe. You might be a great swimmer, but I don't think you can tread water for a year. So Noah and his family were spared from what God knew was going to be catastrophic to everybody else on earth. But they were spared by doing what God said to do, by going in and staying there. So they were confined. But what happened when it was over? We read and see how it came to an end as far as the details. The water kept going down and down until finally the ark rested on ground. And so Noah started sending out the birds. And finally, when he sent out a bird that didn't come back, they waited a little while longer. They opened the door. They came out. And what did they do? First thing we read of Noah making a decision of something to do, besides just listening to God and going forth from there, was he built an altar and he sacrificed to God. The first thing that Noah did when they came out of this confinement was worship God. Now, why do you build an altar? When you build an altar for sacrifice, what are you intending to sacrifice? Animals. Blood. Why in the Bible did anybody ever receive a commandment from God to sacrifice an animal, sacrifice blood? You know, there were other kinds of offerings. The meal offerings, the meat offerings, the drink offerings, many different kinds of offerings, grain offerings. What was the purpose anytime blood was involved? Forgiveness of sin. It was always about sin. Some of the other offerings were about thanksgiving and appreciating what God had done, acknowledging that he provided for them and gave them what they needed. But anytime there was a sacrifice that involved blood, it had to do with sin. I wonder why the first thing Noah decided to do when he got off the ark was offer sacrifice that had to do with sin. because he just had a 1 year long picture of God's attitude about sin and the destruction of everybody in the world except his family. You couldn't get a more close-up or better picture of what God thought and felt about sin than to have gone through something like this, a worldwide judgment. So Noah comes out and offers sacrifice. He immediately worships God. That should tell us something. We've heard a lot of people talk about this confinement, this quarantine, and how their faith has struggled because they've been closed up at home. Let me say this. Let me say this loudly and very plainly. If your faith suffered through these weeks of quarantine, it is your fault. Now, I don't mean that ugly. I said loudly and plainly, not ugly. If your faith suffered, that's on you. Because where was God before this quarantine? If you're a Christian, was he with you? Where was God during this quarantine? Was he with you? Where is he now that this quarantine is lifting and things are kind of going back toward normal? He should still be with you. So if your faith faltered, if you were spiritually suffering, in a sense that your faith is hurting, I don't mean suffering because you're not getting to see the brethren. That's normal. We're missing each other. If your faith is suffering throughout an ordeal like this, God is here. God was there. God was with you. God is always open and ready and involved and reachable. So what were we doing before the quarantine that left us in such a state that during the quarantine we lost God? And what makes us think that coming out of the quarantine automatically is going to make us have God again? When we look at it from that standpoint, it's not about looking at God, it's about looking at self, who we are, looking at our own faith, our own lives. If we're living and having the relationship with God before this quarantine, then we should have had that relationship with God all through this, whether it lasted for 2 months or 2 years. When Noah came off the ark, the first thing he did is build an altar and sacrifice. He worshiped God. I know Noah was happy to be off the ark. I'm sure his whole family were so happy to have their feet on dry ground again. Oh, they'd been dry, but they'd been standing in the wood of an ark. They hadn't been on the dry land of the earth. Don't you know how excited they were when they stepped off of that ark and their feet hit dirt? But you know how that would have made them feel? After a year, when they came off, Noah builds an altar and he sacrifices. We need to think and realize how important our lives with God are every day. Every day. There are other things in this life, things that God told us are good things, necessary things, things that we should be doing, that take of our time and our efforts and our energy, like our families, our jobs, many good things. But there should not ever be anything that takes a daily precedence over the rest of our lives more than our relationship with God. That should be our primary focus every day. I hear Christians oftentimes saying, well, I get so caught up in the things of life that sometimes God gets put on the back burner. Sometimes I struggle to have enough time for God. Listen, the only reason you have time is because of God. So God expects us to use our time wisely. If we've got so much on our plate that, and I'm not talking about evil things, I'm talking about good things. If we've got so much on our plate every day that we have to work to squeeze in a moment for God, then we've got too much on our plates. And we need to take something off. We need to take as much off as we need to so that God gets the focus, the attention that he should get. I would dare say that throughout that year, Nobody in a year probably ever focused on God more than Noah did and his family. Can you imagine them thinking about anything else during that year? You wake up in the morning, you're on the ark. You go about your day, it's all on the ark. You end the day and finally lay down among the animals to get some sleep, and you're still on the ark, only to do that again the next day and the next day for 375 days. That's a long time. And I bet you there was not any part of any day that went by that they didn't think about the reason they were there. Didn't think about God who put them there. I don't mean in a bad way, I mean in a very good way, so that they could be spared from what everybody else suffered. So he comes off the ark, he builds an altar, and he worships God. You know, Noah saw the ending of that quarantine as a very important point in his life. That doesn't mean he came out of there and never did anything wrong again. We read about further problems with Noah, just like we do with other people in the Bible. It's one of the great things we see about the Bible and helps us see the truth in what's being shown. God doesn't sugarcoat things. He doesn't try to paint somebody in a picture that's unattainable, that we can't understand and look at and compare to ourselves. Was Noah a good man, a faithful man, a servant of God? Yes. Did Noah sin? Yes. If Noah and his family didn't sin, then why was an altar built and an animal or animals, we don't know how many, died? So we're not looking at a man who didn't need forgiveness, but we're looking at a man who received forgiveness because he turned to God. He did what he was supposed to do, and that should be the attitude that we have. Before a problem comes, whatever problem that comes, all the way through it, and on the other side of it. If we come through it and we're still able to live and be ourselves in this world, then we should be holding on to God all the way through the situation. That's what we see with Noah. We see another thing here, another picture that's given here. Noah was blessed by God. He was blessed by God before the flood. He was blessed by God during the flood. And he was blessed by God after the flood. How was he blessed? It's easy to see before and after. How was he blessed during the flood? He was alive. That was one great blessing, wasn't it? He was alive physically. More importantly, he was alive spiritually. He was blessed during the flood. God had provided the place where he could be safe physically. He provided the instructions so that they would have the food they needed. They would have shelter from the storm. They had everything to get through this. His family right there with him. We see some very strong blessings there. We might look at his life before the flood and after the flood and say, look at all the more blessing he had. Is it really more blessing? Or is it just more things? How could you be more blessed than to be one of those 8 people on the ark? How could you be any more blessed than that? Oh, they had different things about them. They had people around them. They had society around them. They had a lot of other things in their life. But they were blessed by God all the way through this scenario, which makes us see another picture. Who was in control of all of this? God was. Now, in the situation of the flood, we read about God's decision to bring the flood, how long it lasted, when it was going to end, when Noah was going to get on the ark, how long he was going to stay there, so thus when he was going to get off. All of those decisions were made by God. So we can't take that and make an exact parallel to things happening today, because God hasn't told me or you or anybody else in this world today, he hasn't told us a big ordeal and problem is coming and I'm the one that's going to make it happen. And when it comes, him saying, this is what I was telling you about. This is it. This is the big scenario. And when it's over, God's saying, okay, that's it. It's over. It's done. Get out of there and go on with living. We don't have God's information telling us these things. I remember back some years ago when Hurricane Katrina came up and hit New Orleans in that area so strongly. You all remember that. People were fleeing upward in the country, northward, trying to get away from the coastline. Some folks were displaced for a long time. Some moved permanently, said, I'm not going back. And I don't know how many people in the media, in the religious media, were crying out, God brought that destruction on New Orleans because they were so wicked down there. Well, then why did it stop at New Orleans? If God brought it because they were so wicked, how did they get away? Stop and think for a minute. When God intends to bring judgment on somebody, they don't get away. When everybody in the world was sinful, God said, I'll kill them all. When Sodom and Gomorrah were sinful, He said, I'm going to kill them. How many got away? None. One family left there. Lot and his wife, who didn't totally leave, and his 2 daughters. So one family left, but God sent angels to bring them out. He didn't intend for them to die in there. Nobody got away. When God decides to bring judgment, nobody escapes. That's the way it's always been. If God intends for someone to suffer judgment, then they suffer judgment. Whether it's immediate physical judgment or whether it's eternal judgment. You know what God has assured us of? When the final judgment comes, nobody's going to be left out. If you belong to God, He's not going to lose you. He'll always have you. And if you don't belong to God, He's still going to have you in a different way. He's going to judge you and condemn you, and there will not be any escape. There won't be somebody slipping through the cracks. It's not going to happen. When God judges, God, like in every other facet, is flawless. And when He brings it, it's going to do its purpose. If God brought that hurricane to New Orleans, the people wouldn't have escaped. Every wicked person there would have died, but they didn't. So that tells me one thing. It wasn't a judgment from God. Now, you tell me why it came on New Orleans. Because that's where it hit. Why does it hit New Orleans one time and hit somewhere else another time? And if God's trying to destroy the wickedness, God would do it thoroughly. He'd do it completely. And it would be a judgment that would leave no shadow of doubt or speculation in our minds. Plus, if it's going to be judgment, God would have to tell somebody. Otherwise, what does it mean? What if God didn't talk to Noah? What if God prepared the ark and God put Noah and his family on there and didn't say anything to anybody? Then what point does that make? Do you know how many generations we are removed from the flood? I don't either. It's been a long time. 1,656 years, according to what we add up by genealogies, from the creation until the flood happened. Less time than from the time Jesus died until now. For mankind to become so corrupt that God said, I'm going to kill all of them. I'm sorry that I ever made them. Kind of gives some pictures to us, doesn't it? I hope. When we start looking at this and realizing what happened, God was in control of that. The reason we know God was in control is because He talked about it. He had it written down. So that not only in Noah's time, but also all these generations later, thousands of years later, we still look back at this and we still see God's hand and God's control, both in bringing the judgment, in providing the escape, everything about it. God was in control. Listen, if God's in control and He wants you judged, you're going to be judged. If God's in control, He wants you to be spared, you're going to be spared. So how does it happen today? It doesn't happen that same way. It's not taking place the same way, which means we're not dealing with judgments from God. We're dealing with consequences of sin. You know what was not here back in the beginning? Hurricanes and tornadoes and tsunamis and earthquakes. And we don't read about anything of those sorts until after the flood, when it changed everything about this earth as man knew it. God was in control. He gave not only the assurance to Noah that I'm going to spare you and your family. But when they came off the ark, God gave them further promises. You remember what he told Adam and Eve after he created them about humanity and the earth? Be fruitful and multiply. And they did. They had children, and they had children, and they had children, and the family tree of man just exploded. You know what he told Noah and his family after they came off the ark? Replenish the earth. You're going to be fruitful and multiply again. It started with 2 and built up to however many were here when the flood happened. Now you've got 8. You've got 4 couples. 2 of which, now the first couple, Noah and his wife, Noah's 601 years old. They're not going to have any more children. But he's got 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We don't know their wives' names, but they had children. And then they had children, and they had children, and boom, here it goes again. But God also, showing his control, gave a sign to Noah. What was the sign? The rainbow in the cloud. Do you know how a rainbow happens? I love science. You get water droplets that are in the air, in the atmosphere. When you get all these millions and millions of tiny water droplets, and you're at the right angle, the sunlight that hits those water droplets is first refracted, turns, hits the other side of the water droplet from you, and is reflected. And depending on where the droplets are and the angle that light is refracted and then reflected determines what color you see. Pretty amazing. Apparently, this is the first rainbow. You know why? Because it had never rained before. So now they come off the ark. There's all this evaporated water in the atmosphere, and God shows Noah the first rainbow. And he tells Noah this is a sign of a covenant remember he made a covenant with Noah. I'm going to save you and your family. I'm going to spare you from this judgment. Now he makes another covenant with him. What's that? I will never destroy the earth with water again. Now there are people who read that and say, well, when I was growing up, there was this local flood that destroyed my hometown. It's terrible. It's a catastrophe. It's hard to go through, just like any kind of weather catastrophe like that, but it's not destroying the earth. God has never brought another flood like that and never will. He promised. So when Noah came off the ark and worshiped God, God continued in a relationship with Noah. He gave him a promise. He gave him a promise that I'll never do this kind of judgment on the earth again, not with water. He also gave them a promise of being fruitful. He told them, you be fruitful and multiply. So those younger couples that were about 100 years old were going to start having children. The 600-year-old was done, but the 100-year-old folks were going to start having their children and start replenishing the earth. He also gave them a promise about the fruitfulness of the earth, that the earth is going to keep producing like it did before the flood. It's going to be different now, but it is going to keep producing. And so what do we know about seasons and planting and harvesting? He mentions it right here in this context, that the seasons are going to be there, that there's going to be a time for planting, a time for harvesting, that you're going to learn how this works now. Because before the flood, everything was different. Now you're going to follow these seasons. You're going to follow the planting, the harvesting. The earth's going to keep producing. It's going to keep doing what it's supposed to do. Support mankind. So God was involved. God was in control. And God, out of his grace toward Noah, not only spared him from the flood, but afterwards gave him these promises, gave him the assurance that everything was going to work for them on the earth the way it was supposed to, and that God was still going to provide and still take care of them. Now, they're going to have to do their part, but God is making sure they understand that the earth is going to do exactly what God intended for it to do. Never more going to be a global flood like this. In Hebrews 1, verse 3, there's a statement made that reading about the flood and what God did here should ring for us. He said that God upholds all things by the word of his power. I wonder what it was that caused the fountains of the great deep to break up. The windows of heaven were opened. What do you think caused that? Probably the same thing that brought it all into existence. In the creation, what does it say God did to create everything? He spoke, and it happened. God had the desire, he spoke it, it happened. Creation. Bringing something out of nothing. Something that we can grasp, but I don't know that we ever grasp fully. Because we can't create anything. There's not any person, other than Jesus when he was here, who can look around and say, I have created something in using it that way. We call people creative who come up with ideas and ways to make things happen, but that's not the same word. It's not the same meaning. To bring something out of nothing. We can't do that. Even when I heard somebody argued one time, we make children, but we don't make them out of nothing. We have the elements that God told us we need, male and female, so that we can produce children, but we're not creating them. God's the only one who could create. And the same word of his power that spoke things into existence, no doubt, was the power that was used to cause the flood. He says that's the power that sustains this world. And one day, that's the power that's going to bring an end to this world. When you think about God's involvement and the power that he has, it should make us tremble. It should make us recognize that we are not in the same arena. We are not the same being that God is. Are we similar to him? Yes, in some ways. We're made in his image, after his likeness, but we are not the same as him. We're not equal to him. He didn't create a bunch of gods to be on this earth. He created human beings. And as such, God is very different from us, even though we are like him in the way that we are eternal beings now with a soul. We have the power of choice. We have a mind to reason things out. A lot of things that we do have that make us like God, but we are not God. And we never will be. God was in control. God was involved. God was the one taking care of all of this. What about problems like this virus we're dealing with? Why is it here? It's here for the same reason that AIDS is here. For the same reason that cancer is here. For the same reason that the common cold is here. Same reason that earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis. Why is it here?
You know, when God put man in the garden, they didn't have to worry about all that stuff.
None of that.
And we messed up.
There you go.
Sin.
That's it.
Now we got to, like I said, when you go back and raise the garden, you got to worry about briars or weeds.
Yes.
Drought, water.
Things that he tells us they did not have to worry about in the garden.
Now we got to worry about that. We still have to worry.
That's right. Once sin was committed, things changed. Once the flood came, things changed even more. A lot of differences that have come upon this world, and thus, by consequence, on us as human beings because of sin. It's not God's fault. It's man's fault. It's man's doing. We brought these things upon ourselves through sin. Now, sometimes we suffer directly because of sin. You get drunk, you drive a car, you hit a tree, and you get broken up or you die. Well, that's a direct consequence of doing something that's very ill-advised. Try to say it nicely. You live a promiscuous lifestyle and you end up with an STD. That's a direct suffering because of sin. But there are many, many things that we suffer in this life that we don't do or cause directly. They're here as a consequence of the sin of mankind. And so when we read about the flood, we're reading about a direct action from God. when we are living life and seeing all these other things that happen, we're not reading because God didn't tell us. And again, God doesn't fail in his judgments. So these are not judgments coming from God. These are consequences because of the sins of man. God did not tell Noah when he came off the ark, now you won't have any more problem in this world. No, he just said, now I won't do this again, a flood that will destroy the earth. I will make sure that you're able to produce more human beings, that you're able to plant and grow and harvest. You're able to survive and live. You'll have what you need. But he didn't take away some of the things that he had done before, like when they sinned and were put out of the garden, or now consequences of the flood that changed the earth and everything about it. So Noah is still going to have to live in a world that's suffering the consequence of sin. And as they begin to reproduce, not only the 8 souls that were on the ark that came out, but now their children, grandchildren, and so on, guess what they have to live among once again? Sin. They're still living among sin. When God decided to destroy man, he destroyed all of the sin at that moment. Do you think Noah and his family went through a year on the ark and did not sin? I said they probably thought about God more than anybody ever has in a period of time like that. But do you think they never sinned during that time? I'm sure they did at some point. Otherwise, when he gets off the ark, why does he first thing build an altar and offer sacrifice? But Noah is going to live again in a world that begins to be more and more filled by sin. You think the world was any more wicked in the days of Noah before the flood than it is today? You might do it by percentage and say perhaps there may be more Christians on the earth today who are faithfully serving God percentage-wise than there were faithful people in Noah's day. If there were many faithful people in Noah's day, I would have to assume that there would have been more people on the ark. So percentage-wise, maybe. But the same wickedness is here. Same kinds of sins. What new kind of sin has anybody come up with? What new sin have you learned about in your lifetime that you think never existed before? It may have a different face on it, a different name given to it, maybe carried out in a different way. But there aren't any new sins coming up. I would dare say there's not any sin around today that wasn't around during Adam's lifetime. Just maybe carried out in different forms. So Noah comes out of the ark, his family, they come out of the ark, and sin that was the problem that put them in there is still going to be here in the world, is still going to be surrounding them. And we need to understand that we don't need to think that this world is going to be so drastically different after a 2 or 3 month virus and quarantine. You know, before this happened, we lived in a world that was filled with sin.
Remember, Brother Mosier, repeating what God said before the flood about man? I know you're going to remember that. It says,
Every imagination and thought of his heart was only evil continually.
and what did it say after the flood? Same thing.
Same thing.
For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth.
Yes.
Same thing before and after.
Same.
Certainly, Noah would be involved with the environment of sin.
Yes.
But it's the same statement before and after.
That's right.
You remember that, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I do now that you said it. I wouldn't have remembered it on my own. But the point is, ever since the first sin, this world has been a place where man has repeatedly chosen to commit sin. When Noah and his family were the only people that survived the flood, they didn't come out of there and say, you know what, we saw this destruction, so we're never going to sin again. They may have said that. They may have thought that. But they didn't accomplish that. How about you? When you became a Christian, when you learned what sin was doing to you and what your sin was doing to God, and you made the decision to come through the blood of Christ to forgiveness, Did you not make a determination right then? I'm not doing these things anymore. I remember I did. Have you been successful? Completely successful? Me neither. But you know what we have? We have the same thing that Noah had. What's that? The grace of God. God's understanding of man. And God's provision for man. You know what Noah was able to do? Sacrifice. You know what Moses was able to do? Sacrifice. You know what David was able to do? Sacrifice. Do you know what we're able to do? Trust in the sacrifice that was made for us in Jesus' blood. So we're not in a different situation from a broad view like that. Our situation is different because we actually have the sacrifice of Jesus that has been accomplished. Noah didn't have that yet. But Noah's forgiveness with that animal sacrifice was contingent upon the same sacrifice that we trust in. Jesus dying on the cross one day. Noah would not have been forgiven by the blood of animals. He was forgiven by his obedience to God and God's knowledge that Jesus was going to come, that he was going to shed his blood, and that that blood would cleanse Noah just as surely as it's still here to cleanse us today. So we live in a sinful world, a world that's filled with man who has repeatedly, some much more repeatedly than others, chosen to commit sin and live lives filled with sin. But we don't have to live that way. We don't have to think like the world does. We don't have to be like the world is. And in fact, we should see how the world is, and we should work hard for there to be a marked difference between the world and us. When Peter writes about the church and calls them a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, I heard that years ago, preached several times by different people, about us being peculiar, being strange. Well, there's a point to be made with that, but that's not what that means. That doesn't mean we are God's weird people. That's not what that means. Do you know why you get in your car after services and drive home and not mine? It's not just because I have my keys. It's because my name's on it, and your name is on yours. That car that you drove up in tonight is peculiar to you. It belongs to you and you alone. Mine belongs to me and me alone. That's what that means by peculiar. We are his holy priesthood, his royal priesthood, his holy nation, a people who peculiarly belong to God, not to anybody else. We are his and his alone. Now that's a great point to be made. In looking at us, it should be obvious by looking at our lives, the choices we make, the things we say, the things we do. People should be able to see that we're different, but not in that sense of saying we're weird. It's in the sense of saying we belong to God, we want to belong to God, we choose God, and because of that, he has chosen us. We belong to him. Noah belonged to God. That's why Noah was on the ark and his family. And that's why when they came off the ark, God continued to teach them, instruct them, guide them, and provide for them. And God has done that all along throughout the history of mankind. Do you know what the sinner in this world and the saint in this world both get to enjoy? All the material blessings of God. It rains on the just and the unjust. We get to enjoy all the provisions, all the things that God put here for mankind. We get to enjoy that all the time. But so does everybody in the world. You know, if you live in a desert where there's no water, move. There are other places where there's water. Somebody moves to the desert and then complains because it doesn't rain there. Don't move to the desert unless you like to be dry. Don't move to Seattle unless you like to be wet. You know, we can use our brains and we can figure out some things about how some things work in this world. But this world has God's provisions. You know what the saints have that the world will never have as long as they are the world? God's spiritual provisions, spiritual life, eternal life. The simple say simple. Simple in the statement of it. The forgiveness of sins. Much more complex than just saying it. We have the open ear of God. We have His grace. Now, the world has the opportunity of God's grace. Those who are in Christ have God's grace. We have His Son working on our behalf at the right hand of God. Something that the world, as long as they stay the world, will never have. Noah had God when he went on the ark. He had God when he came off the ark. He had a relationship with God that we read some details about. There are others in the Bible that we read about their relationship with God. They had it, and everybody else had the opportunity for it. But not everybody else took that opportunity. Not everybody else made the most of that opportunity. And we need to learn from this situation and so many others that when God provides, God also instructs. He commands. It's all a part of God's grace. Titus 2, verses 11 and 12. When we read about God and His authority, His sovereignty, His judgment, His righteousness, it says that God intends for all men to be saved, and that through His grace He's provided the means of salvation for everybody. But only those who listen to God, who care about what He's saying, who respond properly according to His word, and then walk within that word, are the ones who have that grace working in their lives. People talk about all the grace of God and how wide and magnificent it is. It is, yes. It's magnificent in the way that it's extended to all people. But all people do not have the grace of God. All people have the opportunity of the grace of God. All people have that availability put in front of them. But not everybody has God's grace. Noah had it and was spared from the flood. If you're in Christ today, then you have the grace of God working in your life. We need to make sure that we are the people that we need to be. God is always the God that He should be. And what He has offered to us, what He extends to us, is amazing. But not everybody takes advantage of that. Not everybody follows God, obeys God. Not everybody receives those benefits and blessings. We've got an opportunity right now. If you look at your life and recognize that you have not obeyed the gospel, not obeyed the commands of God, so that you can be forgiven of sins, so that you can be added into Christ, into His body, the church, then you can do that tonight. You can do that on any day, at any moment. When you see your need and you see what God says about it, then you can do God's bidding and you can be forgiven. You can have eternal life. If you're a Christian tonight and you've not been living faithfully, you've not been keeping God in the proper focus, not been walking with Him the way you should, then you can repent. If you've turned away from Him completely, you can come back. God wants His children to stay with Him, and He provides us the opportunity for forgiveness every day that we're living. If you have a need, we have this opportunity. Aaron, you got a song? 835. 835. If you have a need, you can come now as we stand and sing this song.
Good to see everyone. Strange to be here on a Wednesday, isn't it? A little bit. Looking at everybody on a computer screen is different than this. A few announcements that we want to make before we dismiss. Joe's going to have our closing prayer, but before that, several have been on our minds as far as our prayer requests go. Good to see Brenda here. I know you're doing better. Glad to be here. Remember Danita, it's good to see her. She's undergoing treatments. Mr. Jones, Don Jones, he had over the past couple of months that we've been apart, had been dealing with some heart issues. We're able to visit with him just for a few moments several weeks ago, and hopefully he'll be better and be able to be back with us pretty soon. I think he misses being here, so we want to remember him. Also, Ron and Nancy. Of course, Ron is facing a host of issues with his health condition. So are there any others that we need to make mention of publicly as far as our prayer list goes? And probably a lot in the bulletin that we haven't touched on.
Our daughter, Kimberly, will be undergoing surgery down in May Thursday.
Okay. Danny gave me this card. It's from them to the congregation. Thank you for every act of kindness shown to during and after Brenda's recent surgery. We love and appreciate all of you. So appreciate them very much. Glad to see. We'll remember your daughter as well. No other prayer related things. We want to make mention of some activities that are going on this coming Sunday. We'll resume with our Sunday evening service. Yes, sir. At 5 o'clock. So and it is the fourth Sunday, but we're going to meet at 5 o'clock. Following the services this coming Sunday, Scott has a Devo and some things planned for our youth group. They're going to be doing some tie-dyeing. So the young folks, there's a blurb in the bulletin about this, but bring your own T-shirt and or pair of socks that you'd want to tie-dye. And then there's some designations for the boys and the girls to bring food, but that's in the bulletin. Get a bulletin on your way out so you'll be aware of that. But this coming Sunday, following the evening services, that youth Devo with the tie-dye will be right after that. Also, in the bulletin is noted, there's no time that I could tell, but since so many things have been canceled or postponed, the 4th of July festivities that normally go on around town have been broomed. So we are going to be having some time here at the building together, tailgating and separating and eating and whatever we're going to do and how we do that. Some more information will be coming about that for the July 4th here at the building. For our youth group, again, on July 11th, the formal that had been initially set for sometime in April is going to be held on July the 11th here at the building at 6 p.m. So make plans to be a part of that. Let Scott know that you want to be a part of that. Finally, as Dave mentioned, as we go through the summer, meeting again on Wednesdays, any of the men who would like to speak on one of the Wednesdays, I think Dave is going to organize that. So if you want to touch base with him, I've just self-appointed Dave to be the organizer of the Wednesday night summer series, as it were. So next week is covered, but it looks like to me there's about 7 Wednesdays between now or after next week up till the end of August. So get with Dave if one of you fellows would like to fill in one of those Wednesdays. Voluntold. That's good. So if there are no other announcements, yes, sir.
The camp board and again, he will be meeting tomorrow night. If anybody has any suggestions about what we could do there possibly in the fall of the year, pass that along to me.
If you couldn't hear what Danny mentioned, he said the board, the Camp Inagahi Board of Directors will be meeting tomorrow night regarding what they may be able to do as far as camp for the fall. If you have any ideas, then you can pass those along to Danny, who can share them with the folks who are on the board. So if there are no other announcements, Joe's going to have our closing prayer. We'll be dismissed.
Y'all just know, Father God, we come to you today, so thankful
graze over and take for granted every day. We ask you to be with us each day, that we keep in mind what you've given us, that we would stop taking that for granted and use every opportunity we get to spread your word. We ask you to be with Brother Don Jones, be with Ron and Nancy, and Kimberly with their surgeries they've had, and what's coming through with their health issues, that you be with them and with their doctors, that if it's at all possible, they return to the version of normal that's the best of their health, and that'll lead them back to being able to worship you, Father. We ask you to be with us all as we go through these days, and be with those that I've forgotten to mention, Father. We ask you to be with all of us, that we would shine as a light for you, Father, and that we spread your word. Be with those that have gained an inkling of faith in these hard times, that rather than being snuffed out by the current era in this country, that it would be strengthened, that they find a way to worship. Be with us as we go about this week, that what we do is pleasing in your sight. Ask you to forgive us as we fall, Father, and we know who you are. These things we pray in your